Everybody have a copy? Okay, we're picking up chapter 3 on page 41. So, the Sixth Patriarch is continuing this extended analogy, really what it is, of describing the Pure Land, which is one of the places that many Buddhists aspire to go to be reborn in. It's at the heart of the Pure Land practice. But what he's doing here is he's bringing it back from its usual understanding as a place that is apart from this world and as a state that is also apart from the worldly and surrounded by things that are not ordinary. And he's transforming this whole thing to bring it back to the here and now. And he's making a claim or a statement that's at the heart of his direct teaching that the present mind, the here and now, is in fact the only place and the only ground of awakening, of the Pure Land, and in fact of Buddhahood itself. So he says it's not distant, it's not in the past, it's not in the future, it's right in the present, in the here and now. Now we started by this passage. He asked them if they wanted to see the Pure Land. They said they did. He said, I'm going to bring it and show it to you for all of you to see. But then he obviously slipped right into this analogy and started by saying your own physical body is the city of the Pure Land. This is important because there can be misunderstanding in a practice that has to do with regulating the mind and getting a handle on raw emotions, disciplining oneself, which is one of the meanings of the word vinaya or shila. It has to do with a kind of bringing your impulses, emotions, cravings, and desires into some kind of control or management where you're not just being whipped around. And so sometimes this can seem to be a kind of denial or renunciation or even a harshness on the flesh, you could say a kind of asceticism or even a denial of the body. But Buddhism, and especially in this teaching here, he's making it very clear that your own physical body is something you need to work with, not deny, because it's a city of the Pure Land. So he's saying it's not the body itself that is a problem. It's the use of the body or a misuse of the body. Used well, it becomes a vehicle for awakening. Used poorly, it becomes a chain. It becomes an impediment. So it's very clear here he's not creating this false dichotomy of saying body and mind or soul and spirit and then the material or immaterial. He's not going that way at all. From his point of view, these are all the elements that we have to work with, and the body is one of them. The 6 sense gates, he goes through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and he talks about these as being, if they are wholesome, if they're in control, if they're managed, if they're not deviating from a true center, then they work. They actually create insight and awakening. It's not outside this body that we attain awakening. So the denial of the flesh in and of itself doesn't lead to awakening. And you can see this when the Buddha began. There was a sect of cultivators in India at this time when he began, when the present Buddha Siddhartha began, who believed that you could attain deliverance or moksha, liberation from transmigration, through basically getting rid of the body. It was, in a sense, a kind of slow form of suicide, because they went into a bitter asceticism that just held the body in by the thinnest thread of existence. And so he thought at the time when he began that maybe this was the resolution, that it's the materialism, the sensuality, the craving, and the consequent kind of unsatisfactory feeling that follows that, yet the craving continues, there's satisfaction momentarily leading to deeper craving and so forth. He thought maybe he could get out of this cycle by renouncing the flesh. And so you see sometimes if you go to Buddhist iconography, I don't think we have any here. I have one upstairs, but I didn't bring it down. It shows the Buddha called the patient immortal. That's usually what the phrase is. And you see the Buddha sitting there, he's just skin and bones. You can count the ribs. And this is the image to represent that extreme asceticism and denial of the flesh of the body that he went through at that time. And he realized it brought no liberation whatsoever. It brought all kinds of altered states of consciousness, but none of these were penetrating and actually leaving samsara. And so he stepped away from that. And this is the story you have where he accepted rice gruel, or depending on the translation, porridge. Sometimes it's running custard. I kind of like that one, custard. He accepted custard from a herder. I think it was probably a young woman who was herding sheep or cattle. And he brought his body back to a state, what he calls the middle way. Not too much, not too little. In health, but not over the top. Not deficient, not wanting. And so in that state, then he went off to cultivate, and through that middle way of not too much, not too little, not indulgent, not denial, he attained Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. He actually penetrated through the delusion and attained full awakening. And this then becomes the sort of central teaching that we're heirs to, which is this idea of the middle way. In all things, finding that appropriate spot of balance. The middle way doesn't mean today you get stoned and drunk and then tomorrow you go sober, and between the two there's a middle. It's not talking about something like that. It's talking about in every thought and every moment you're in this state of balance and equilibrium. It's not like you add up, the year, half this, 6 months of this, 6 months of that, and yeah, that's my middle way. That's not it. And so he goes through and he says this is important. You use the mind, you use the body, you use the sense organs. And he says when they're well cared for, everything works. But when you don't take care of them, when you don't attend to them, then things fall apart. We find this throughout the teachings. Mencius has a wonderful passage when he says the mind, the heart, is the repository of all that comes to us in life, either good or bad. Well tended, everything flourishes. Neglected, everything drifts away. And so his point would be, also from Mencius' point of view, that this is intrinsic and innate. We have it to begin with. It's not something we have to go seek. We only have to take care of it. We only have to nurture it. And so the whole emphasis on at least that Confucian tradition is expressed in Shouxing Weiban, that this cultivation of ourselves is the root of everything else. Our relationships come from how we're cultivating our emotions, our mind. Our family harmony or disharmony comes from this cultivation of our own person. The well-being of a city or a state comes from individuals who are doing this. You can't get at it any other way. It can't be legislated from the top down. It can't be mandated by law. It comes through the cultivation and rectification and balancing of heart and mind. This is at the heart of what makes everything work. This is, from a Confucian point of view, but it's pretty interesting how it corresponds to this. And so Mencius would say then, the most important thing is to find this true heart and mind, to take care of it, never leave it. So he says the purpose of study, now I'm going back to Confucius. I jump around. I'm going back to Confucius from Mencius, but it's the same school, more or less. So Confucius says, the whole goal of being a person is to develop mastery and insight into this heart-mind. And Mencius says the whole point of education is to recover it if you lost it. When's the last time you saw that in a catalog for the university? Our program is to cover a lost mind. It consists of nothing else. But he says, once you find it, once you recover it, then nurture it, keep it. Don't let it go. Don't let it stray. How does it stray? He says, because inside, you don't pay attention to desires and impulses and thoughts that are off. And you just sort of let them take you. Outside, you don't associate with good friends. You don't have a right livelihood, and so this can pollute you. So it's important to have an internal, external environment in harmony with this heart and mind, and then it works. And he said, if you lose it, go find it again. Now, he says, once you got it, and once you maintain it, then he's got a very interesting thing. He says, let it shine. Let it shine. This is my translation, of course, Ming Ming De, which is not a standard translation. Ming Ming De means radiate with this goodness. And you radiate because you want to uplift humanity. So the goal is to radiate this goodness to support and nurture humankind, human beings, the environment as well. But this begins with having that heart centered and clear. When it's centered and clear, it radiates by itself. And we're going to go tonight to radiance in this passage too. And so the formula is pretty much the same. But this teaching is such that the Pure Land begins in the smallest of places, in one's own heart and mind. And when that is starting to get squared away and rectified, everything else builds upon that naturally. It's like the seed, it's the germ from which all things sprout. So this is why this passage is really important. Then he says in this next paragraph, he says, Buddhahood, whatever that is, representing the perfection of our humanity, the complete release from suffering and full awakening, is realized within the essential nature, our true nature. Don't seek for it outside yourself. Now, what this means is don't look to have some other power, some other force, some other magical thing bestow it upon you. It comes from cultivating the ground of your own being. That's the only way that this comes about, is what he's saying. So do not look outside. Outside here means to others to do it. It also means to other powers and forces, or to other mechanisms like magic, divination, astrology, drugs. Now you're thinking, no, drugs. We know that drugs aren't salvation because people. But there was a time, some of you are old enough to remember, when certain drugs were presented as profound vehicles for liberation and awakening. Now, those of you who are smiling, I know you're just smiling because you heard about it. You didn't really go down that path. But in the 60s and 70s, and also in the, ancient times, even in India, because Xuanzang, when he went to India, met the equivalent of Tim Leary there, who offered him the possibility of having Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi through a mushroom drug potion that was a cult in India at the time. Now we rush forward to the 1960s and 70s, and whether it's reincarnation or what, I don't know, but the phenomena appeared again. And so when I was in college, I was offered the opportunity to turn on, tune in, and drop out, and get enlightened with a pure, odorless, colorless substance called lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD. It's making a comeback, by the way. I just read an article in the New Yorker how it's coming back. The French say the more things change, the more they stay the same. So those of you who don't believe this and think you can get enlightened by that, I guess you could try, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Xuanzang, by the way, did not join the cult. He was tempted. He said, gee, sitting meditation, it hurts the legs. Wow, man, if I just swallow this stuff and I get it. And he said, come on, everything I read says it can't be that easy. And he said, moreover, I know essentially if I look outside, it's not the true way. He understood the principle, therefore, he didn't join the cult in any event. So this is what it means, do not seek outside yourself. Confused, and this is really interesting, confused, this essential nature is just a living being. It's the unrealized. But enlightened or awakened, this essential nature is a Buddha. So here you have one nature. It's called the essential nature. And it's not saying it's fixed, it's a Buddha. It's because you could say, okay, I have the Buddha nature, how come I'm not a Buddha? So the nature really isn't the Buddha nature, it failed me, it's deficient. He's saying the Buddha nature contains all the possibilities of the human, all the possibilities of the Dharma realm. The 10 Dharma realms come from this essential nature. Hells, animals, ghosts, people, devas, asuras, up to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are a manifestation along this continuum of the essential nature. So what's the difference? It's how you use it. It's not that you just have it and magically turns in or magically doesn't turn to something else. It's how you use it. So he's saying when we are confused, this essential nature just keeps us as an ordinary living being, subject to the vicissitudes of decay, time, suffering, and confusion. The self-nature is a Buddha. When you're awakened, then the self-nature is used in another way and it manifests as Buddha. Okay, so this is really, this is probably one of the more important lines of this whole text. Because if he says do not seek outside, it only makes sense to me, and it only has any compelling logic if by seeking within my own being, there's some prospect that I could actually make this. But if I feel as if I am deficient and lacking, I don't have the wherewithal, I don't have trust and confidence in this nature, then to actually cultivate myself would be maybe at best fruitless, at worst almost despairing. It would be like hitting your head against the wall and you'd never be able to penetrate. So this doesn't make sense to say seek within yourself unless the next thing is true, that you could actually do that and have some attainment or accomplishment with it. Okay, so how do you know that? See, this is the trick. How do you know that? Anybody? He's making a claim here. How would you, let's assume none of us are Buddhas. I don't know. But let's just assume for the sake of argument that a few of us here in the room are not Buddhas, and we're told to seek within. What confidence could we have in this?
Your own experience.
Aha. It's interesting because you could say, well, just believe in the Buddha, or just believe in Hui Neng, or just believe that I said it. But really, the proof is in the pudding. In other words, I would say at the very least, you take this as a hypothesis to be tested. You don't take it on just faith and then sort of wait for Godot or wait for the Buddha. Nor do you throw it out of the absence of faith, out of radical skepticism and denial. Neither one of those positions are sustainable until you have enough evidence to move one way or the other. So to deny it a priori is to not even give it a shot, and to affirm it a priori is a little naive. And so you'd have to take it as a working hypothesis and test it out, which is in fact exactly what the Buddha exhorted us to do in the turning of the Dharma wheel. In the third turning of the Dharma wheel, he says, know this for yourselves. That's the only thing that matters. You have to affirm it for your own direct experience. You can't just take it on faith. You can begin with faith, but not end there. And so then you begin, actually, this is very close to an American philosopher, an eccentric, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Some of you know about Ralph Waldo Emerson. He had a disciple, Thoreau. But Emerson had a statement similar to this. He says, it's from his essay on self-reliance, and he says something like this. There comes a time in everyone's education when he or she arrives at the conviction that envy of others is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that you must take yourself for better or worse as your nature. And then he says, the ground bestowed upon you, this nature that you till, is the only place that any nourishing corn can come from. So he uses a corn. This ground bestowed upon you is the only ground from which this corn can come. And then he has this very interesting line, and he says, no one knows what he or she can do, or can they know until they try. This is interesting. No one knows what they can do, or will they know until they try. So it's only in the trying that you will know. not in affirming or denying in advance. So it's a very similar thing, which is, that essay is called Self-Reliance, but isn't this a kind of quintessential spiritual self-reliant essay? I think so. Because he's saying, rely on yourself here. And he's saying, don't doubt yourself. So to not doubt yourself doesn't mean to be arrogant. It means just to cherish the capacity you have and nurture it and bring it along, rather than to assume you've already arrived, which is arrogance. Or the opposite is inferiority, to assume that you can't. Either way, you go off to two extremes. So here he's saying, then he goes into this interesting passage here. So he says, the enlightened self-nature is a Buddha. Now he says, kindness and compassion are avalokiteshvara, sympathetic joy and equanimity are maha-mastaprapta, purifying oneself is Shakyamuni, and to be unprejudiced and free of guile is Amitabha. Now, he's extending the analogy and talking about these enlightened beings, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, that we normally think about as outside, distant, accomplished beings. And you can see here depictions, iconic depictions of how they're represented symbolically. These are not actual Nikon photos of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But realize this. These are artistic representations, and in this art form, the art is largely symbolic. It's not literal. So it's presenting figures or icons that represent certain qualities of character and being of mind. They are not meant to represent the actual physical appearance of this being. This is really important to understand, because, you know, riding on the elephant, that's not necessarily, that's symbolic, okay? The elephant's symbolic, the riding the elephant's symbolic, the flower is symbolic, the sword is symbolic, okay? All of these things are symbolism, and we're not going to go into Buddhist art tonight, but I just want to be clear that sometimes the representation of these are symbolic. But he's saying further here is that there is, if the Buddha is within your own mind, then all these beings are also coming from that essential nature. And when the essential nature is full and replete, it contains all of these. So here, by analogy, he is making a statement. By analogy, he's saying, what is Avalokiteshvara, which is in Chinese Guanyin Bodhisattva, which is the Bodhisattva of great compassion. So the qualities of compassion are exemplified in this figure called Avalokiteshvara, but he's also saying that Avalokiteshvara is your own development and realization of kindness and compassion. And then sympathetic joy and equanimity are maha-mastaprapta. Anybody notice anything here about these two? What maha-mastaprapta is great strength bodhisattva. By the way, great strength bodhisattva is generally rendered as a woman. So you guys think about, what would the strength then be? It obviously isn't testosterone. So it's another kind of strength. In any event, it doesn't matter men or women, because this is artificial in these representations, since these are neither male or female, okay? And even the representation of these is just an expedient. But that being said, Maha-mastaprapta and Avalokiteshvara, where do they appear? Now, don't tell me they appear to you before you go to sleep at night. I mean, where do they appear? Do you ever see the three sages of the Pure Land? Where do we have it? Any picture? Oh, is that it there? No? My eyes don't see that far. Is that? I guess we don't have an image here. Generally, you see three. If you look at the iconography, Amitabha Buddha's in the center, and on one side is Avalokiteshvara, and the other side is great strength. And these are considered to be.
This is great strength. That's Guan Bodhisattva, and this middle one is.
Okay, so they're in America, and they needed to have their individuality expressed. They couldn't be side by side in one shot, so they have their own little portraits. Over here you have Great Strength Bodhisattva. Over here you have Guanyin, and in the center up here you have Amitabha. Okay, so these are considered to be the three sages. So he's playing on the analogy of the Pure Land by showing them that Avalokiteshvara is, by analogy, kindness and compassion, and the sympathetic joy and equanimity are great strength. By the way, these four things, kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, are called the four limitless minds. Actually, the four Brahma Viharas. Sibei, Shi, She, okay, in Chinese. And these are considered to be the pure qualities of an awakened being. That when you are in this state, stinginess and hatefulness is gone, indifference to others is gone, sympathetic joy means you delight in other people's accomplishments and achievements. That's where you find joy. You don't say, I got it. And you don't take, what do we call it, Schadenfreude, which is the German word for delight in others' suffering. Okay? That's the opposite of sympathetic joy. And equanimity means you have this impartial openness to all beings and all things and all states. These are considered to be the four limitless minds, the four boundless minds: kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And you see them represented here. And then by analogy, the Sixth Patriarch compares them to these beings. By the way, there's a little difference between kindness and compassion. Often they're blended together, and then often they're mistaken for a kind of emotional warmth and caring exclusively. And this is really not accurate. Kindness here, I guess the closest would be similar to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would wish them to do unto you, and conversely, do not do unto others as you would not wish them to do unto you. That's kindness. It comes from kin. So it means treating as family in the sense that you have a golden rule operating in your family. Not all families have that, and so we want to have family and marriage counselors all throughout California. But ideally, you would have these feelings of the golden rule towards your kin. Compassion is a little different. Compassion is actually a manifestation of a functioning that comes out of wisdom. And so, with wisdom and insight into the true nature of things and the origins of suffering and the end of suffering, how this all works, comes this aspiration to want to see other beings free of suffering. So it's an aspiration, a turning of the mind of concern and commitment to help bring living beings to an end of suffering. And it's coming from insight that's based on wisdom. It's not just coming from, I feel sorry, or I feel sympathetic, or I feel empathetic, which is closer to kindness. Compassion is governed by wisdom. So it's an action of wisdom. It's a functioning of wisdom. It's not just a feeling. It doesn't even always manifest as caring, gentleness, warmth, and huggies. Okay? Because if the aspiration is to end suffering, sometimes suffering needs a hug. Sometimes suffering needs a pat. Some kind words. And sometimes to end suffering, you need harsh words. You need a standing off. You might even need a scolding. And so compassion manifests in 1,000 different forms. That's why when you look at the image of Guanyin Bodhisattva, you don't just always see, especially the 1,000 eyes, 1,000 hand Bodhisattva. I don't know if we have one here. If you go to the city of 10,000 Buddhas, right, well, the big one, you see the big one, you can't see, all you see is like these hands. But if you look at it really closely, especially if you go around to the back, see in the front you have this kind of Virgin Mary kind face, smiling. But you go around the back and you have things that scare the bejeebers out of you. There's faces up there that just, whoa, make your hair stand on end. That's compassion. What? No, that scared me. But sometimes being scared is a compassionate act to get you from doing something stupid. And so Guanyin's manifesting these, and symbolic, you'd say, does she really look like that with all these heads? And no, it's a symbolic representation of compassion, which has 1,000 different ways of working a release from suffering. Some of those soft, caring, maternal, paternal, gentle, and some of those harsh and gathering in and subduing. These are the two things that the function of compassion, to gather in and subdue. So a real compassionate act could be mistaken for harshness or scolding. I won't dwell on this too long. Remember the story I told from Skinny Gotami? I told a couple weeks ago. Who remembers Skinny Gotami? Remember the woman who lost her baby and then went around asking for medicine to bring her baby back to life. They told her to go to the Buddha to give her medicine. And when she goes to the Buddha doesn't say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. Come, let me hold your baby. Even if I can't bring it back to life, I assure you your baby's born in the Pure Land is really much happier than here," and all that, Doesn't do that, which you would think would be the compassionate response. He says, "No, I'll tell you where you get the medicine. Go and get a mustard seed from any house in the village, but it has to be a house where nobody's died." And so she goes off, and she's driven, she's anxious, she's hyped, she's thinking and she goes to house, and everybody has a mustard seed, but nobody has a mustard seed where there's been no death in that house. And gradually, through this, she breaks through her attachment and her suffering that she's been hanging on to. Not just the suffering of the loss of the child, but I won't relate the story because it really is complicated, but the suffering that brought along the attachment to the child. In the first place, she breaks through all of this. She ends her suffering. Now, on the face of it, you could say this is questionably a compassionate act. Someone comes in grief and you send them on this sort of wild goose chase, running around instead of just comfort him. But the end result was, by doing that, he released her from her suffering. So that's why if you have wisdom, you can be compassionate. But if you think it's just feeling close to, warm with, connecting with, and loving and all of this, that's maybe sometimes compassion, but the rest of it won't be, and you'll burn out. In true compassion, there's no burnout. When I hear people say, "Oh, there's a compassion burnout, nobody wants," no. Compassion doesn't burn out. The self-nature doesn't burn out. Because wisdom is always appropriate. And when it's appropriate, there's no too much and no too little, and there's no burning out. Misguided compassion without wisdom burns out. I used to do that. I worked in a number of positions where I thought I was compassionate, and I burned out really fast because there was no wisdom behind it. There was just energy pouring out with no wise exertion of energy. So this is important. Then he says, purifying oneself is Shakyamuni. Now this is interesting because he's saying the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, by the way, one of the translations of that Shakyamuni is obviously the Muni or sage of the Shakya clan. So that's where that name comes from. It's an actually Indian epithet given to him as the one within the Shakya clan, which was one of the caste, where he was a sage within this, but it also means able to be humane. So Shakyamuni also has a Muni able to be humane. What I like about that is it represents that the idea that a Buddha is a human being who perfects their humaneness, and by perfecting their humaneness becomes Buddha. Okay, so again, it's not outside the human that this happens, but within the fulfillment of the human. So able to be humane has a double meaning, not only to express humaneness, but to actually realize humaneness. And then he says, and then to be unprejudiced and free of guile is Amitabha. So he completes the list here. Now, he goes on to continue the analogy. And please, this is analogy. So some of this is going to make sense of this, some of this is not. Egoism and arrogance. By contrast, now what he's saying is the opposite of the development of our full potential is to be egotistical and arrogant. This is Mount Sumru. Why Mount Sumru? What's Mount Sumru? Anybody here climb Mount Sumru yet? It's one of K-12, and then Everest, and no? Nobody's done Sumru? What is Sumru? Anybody know? It's obviously, a symbolic mountain.
Wonderfully tall.
Huh?
Wonderfully tall.
Yeah, inconceivably tall. but that's one of the translations. But it's said to be a mountain that is huge, tall, beyond measure. It's at the center of every world system. And I'm not going to go into Buddhist cosmology here, but it's represented as this incredibly tall, anchoring mountain at the center of every world system. But it's here he's using it as an analogy. He's saying egotism and arrogance are nobody's bigger or higher than me. That's what he's saying here. Okay, that's Mount Sumro. Sensual desires are the ocean's waters, and afflictions are its waves. Now he's slipping into another analogy. He's not literally saying sensual desires are the waves on the water, right? Afflictions are its waves, and so forth. He's giving an analogy. When the water of our nature is stirred up, this ocean-wide nature, what's sometimes called the ocean of wisdom, when this is stirred up by our desires, the desires then lead to the waves, which are the responses to that stirring up, which are the afflictions. So ignorance, let's say avidya, which means misunderstanding, and thirst, trishna, generate actions. The sensual actions mean grasping, seeking, wanting, attaching actions. And these actions then create the waves that come back as afflictions, as negative karma, as entanglements. So in a sense, he's saying the water is calm and pure. The myriad things are perfectly reflected in it, like the still waters on a clear night. But when the waters get stirred up by trishna and avidya, by these desire and misunderstanding, it sets in motion actions that bring return as consequences, and these consequences are then the waves of the water of our afflictions. What's interesting about this is once the stirring up stops, the waves settle by themselves. The waves are not something that just keeps coming. They require inertia. They require something to set them in motion. And if they're going to stay in motion, they have to then have continuous input. Stillness then is not tuning out and going dead. Stillness is letting the water settle. Letting the water settle so that this clear nature is always radiant and reflective. And in that radiant and reflective state, very active, very dynamic, very observant. This is what it means. Wisdom everywhere examines, yet is forever still. Wisdom, this calmness, everywhere examines. He says everywhere engaged, nowhere attached. It's the same expression. Okay? So, let's finish then. Cruelty is an evil dragon. Vanity and dissoluteness are the ghosts and spirits. He's just comparing human afflictions, qualities, negative states to these. Ghosts and spirits, dragons, and you can say, well, I like dragons. Well, generally here, he says an evil dragon, so it's not a good dragon. Okay? This is the evil dragon that will burn you up. So what is he saying here? He's saying you create a monster with your cruelty. Okay, this is really interesting. You turn yourself into a dragon with your cruelty. Why, when children represent these things, do they paint these figures? It's because in their minds they're clear. An evil dragon is cruel. An evil dragon is not kind. As children, we know these metaphors really quite accurately work. And so when you see, I saw someone portrayed their father. Daddy went out and got drunk and lost his money in Las Vegas, got into a fight and came home, and the kid's picture of Daddy was this big hulking figure coming in the door with smoke shooting out the nose and fire coming out of the ears and sharp teeth. Okay? And the kid wanted to hide because Daddy was going to take it out on the kid. That kid's representation is the evil dragon that is created by cruelty. So you want to think about this. Think of what you turn into when you get cruel. Now, the thing you got to do is you got to get really cruel, really pissed, really angry, really full of hate, and then hold a mirror up. No, seriously, and look and see what you see. And it's not going to be mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. You're going to see the evil dragon. Now, what the text is saying, interestingly, is you can take this as analogy or you can take it as literal. That in fact, the plasticity of the nature over time, rendered this way again and again with thoughts of evil and hatred and so forth, actually turns into a different being. Now, it might not happen overnight. Sometimes it can happen pretty quickly. You can see a change in somebody going downhill or uphill pretty quickly. But sometimes it's very gradual. In this text, since time is relative and not a matter of importance, only consciousness matters, this transformation would take place maybe over lifetimes. So what he's describing here is the mutability, the possibilities of us becoming different than we are right now, better or worse, based on these emotions and these actions of mind. This is really interesting. So he's not saying, well, it's some god of karma that rules over this, or you die and they say, oh, let's see, what will I make you into next time, you know. Well, flip a coin, I'm bored, I'd like to see you be a hydra, you know, or I'd like, you know, we need a few more gods in the choir. And so, no, it doesn't work like that. It's like driven by your actual conscious intentional actions that create these mutability, this change and transformation in you. So it's really quite interesting how what he's doing. It's an analogy, yes, but the worldly passions are fish and turtles. I worked on this a long time, and we talked about this, we haven't figured out what this one's about. Except someone said it's like when the fish are all swirling in the water. Like I have a friend who has a koi pond. It's got all these fish in it. And when I go, the fish are kind of looking at me. And if I go over to the container and grab the fish food, and I walk back, all the fish are coming and wanting and fighting for the food. That's the closest I can get about worldly passions are like the fish. Okay? If that works for you, fine. If you've got a better one, come next week. Lust and hatred are the hells, and delusion is the animals. Now, this also corresponds to Buddhist ontology, if you want to call it, or causation, that it is said that the 10 realms of existence, hells, animals, ghost, right? Those are the three, called the three really not so pleasant destinies or paths. Then what? People, Asuras, and Devas. Okay, and those 6 make up the 6 spokes of the wheel. And then there's a sages of Arhats, Pratyekabuddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas. So these are called the 10 realms. Now, on one hand, we think of them as distinct categories unto themselves, but in this model, and in the model that's presented in all the sutras, this is a line of matter and energy along a continuum of the same nature. And so one can go through, across, back and forth, and the driving mechanism of this is not predestination, nor is it fate, nor is it genes, okay? Nor is it divine intervention, but it's karma, meaning the intentional actions of body, speech, and mind that then generate corresponding consequences, results. This is the sculptor, this is the painter, if you want to use the Avatamsaka metaphor. This sculptor creates everything, this mind. And so that's what he's basically describing here with this extended analogy. We don't want to take it too literally, but there are aspects of this that make sense literally, but we don't want to also dismiss it as just a fairy tale, because what's beneath this is a very profound principle when he says, look within yourself, don't look outside, and he's saying in yourself, check out. Is there arrogance? Is there egoism? Are we controlled by central desires, cruelty, vanity, dissoluteness, passions uncontrolled, lust and hatred, delusion? These are the stuff of the kind of creation of someone we wouldn't want to be, but will necessarily come about unless we manage, over that. I think we're out of time here. I'll stop, and then next week we'll go into his formula for how you then cultivate and reverse this. Okay, so I think maybe pause there. Any questions?
Yes, we have a question online.
A question online, okay?
The question is, if the nature contains all dharmas, bad and good, why is it that when it settles, the good manifests?
Because it's beyond good and evil. When it settles, you'll see in the text later, he says, when it settles, it's before good and evil. It's neither. So think about that one.
Or even like prajna or compassion, those qualities.
Remember, do you remember the earlier chapter when he gets the robe and bowl? Remember, he gets the robe and bowl and he gets it secretly because there's a lot of people in the monastery who want it. And then his teacher says, get out of here now, take the robe and bowl and run. And he runs. And then they come and say, who's got the robe and bowl? He says, it's gone. And there's one person, what's his name? No, not Fahai. Who's the martial artist general? Hui Ming. Hui Ming says, I'm going to nail him and get that robe and bowl. So he goes after him and chases him. Right? And this is a great scene. And it's a great thing for a movie if anybody want to make it. Finally, the Sixth Patriarch puts a robe and bowl on a rock and then jumps behind another rock and hides. And Hui Ming is right on his trail. Hui Ming gets there. And this came up in class. I was doing this at Cal last week. And one of the students said, you're talking about this being very direct teaching and, it's straight and logical and rational. But then you got this thing that says he put the robe and bowl on the rock. Hui Ming was unable to grab it. So that sounds like magic. It sounds like Excalibur. The sword's there and he can't pull it out, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, it says he was unable to pull it out. It didn't say only that it was impossible physically. He was unable. Why was he unable? It's equally plausible, without having anything mystical go on here, he realized that by grabbing it, he wouldn't get anything. And he realized that morally he wasn't able to just wrest it by force. And so he actually was unable in the sense that he stopped himself and realized that it would have been fruitless to grab it. So there's two ways to interpret this. And anyway, and then it's followed by, he says, well, let's go, what page is that? Because I'm going to answer the question. I'm not evading this. Where is that? Yes, page, slow, 18. Okay, so we're on page 18. Okay, so start at 17. He says, the robe and bowl are tokens of trust. How can they be seized by force? Aha, that's what he's saying. And then he can't. He tried to pick them up and he couldn't. Now, because he says they're tokens of trust, how can they be seized by force? He then says he was unable. Because he understood there'd be no point of grabbing it. Then he says, cultivator, I've only come for the Dharma, not for the robe and bowl. Then he came out and he bowed. And I hope you'll teach me the Dharma, he said. Then he says, calm your mind, settle down, and I will teach you. Okay? And then Hui Ming was quiet for a long time. And he said, here's the quote, before a thought are good or evil, right at that moment, what is Venerable Hui Ming's original phase? And when he heard this, he experienced a profound awakening. This is the question, before good and evil. So the nature is before good and evil. It doesn't mean an either or back and forth. It means there's something even before notions of good and evil, which are in fact polarities and contrast to each other. So it's a state where not even good and evil arise. It's that pure. In other words, there's not even a thought that has to manifest, and you don't stray from the central meaning of the way. This kind of, yes?
There's another verse that addresses that. It's on page 35, the first stanza.
Good question. 35. Okay. The first true scene?
Yeah, the first stanza.
Okay, so on page 30. True scene is world transcending, false scene is a worldly. False and true both set aside, bodhi nature appears naturally. Now this is hard to imagine. Some people think, oh, that means beyond good and evil. In other words, not subject to cause and effect, amoral, I can do what I want, a kind of nihilistic. That's not what this means. Before good and evil means a state so pure that even the contrast of good and evil doesn't even arise. Wow. So that's the answer. The nature doesn't have that even. The good and evil discrimination, it's before the rising of good and evil that it functions. This one you want to think about. Anyway, Hui Ming, this is fun, Hui Ming wasn't quite, what was that? I love this part. 17, is that where we were? 18. So he experienced a profound awakening. End of story. But sometimes awakenings have little setbacks. Then he questioned him further. He says, other than the secret words and secret meaning you just uttered, is there yet another secret meaning? In other words, he gets us, he has a profound awakening. At the same time, it's so profound, it's so quick, he's not quite sure, did he get it? This is really interesting. In other words, God, that's pretty simple. You know, it's like you hear, simply let go of your false thinking and your attachments, and you immediately realize Buddhahood within your own body right here and now. And the Sixth Patriarch says, so why don't you? Excuse me, why don't you right now just let go and see through it? You say, yeah, whoa. It sounds so simple. He said, well, is there some other secret? So then he asked him, and then the answer is really good. He says, what I told you is not a secret. If you look within yourself, you find the secret is with you. So now we come back full circle, the answer to it. Even if you think it's a secret and it's not, the only place you'd find the answer to that is within you, not outside. I can't give you anything. I can just show you the way. This is just a wonderfully complete circle. Okay, we will pause there and stop for tonight. Yes?
One last question. Page
There's never one last question. That is such a ruse. Okay, go ahead.
Page 41, where you started today, it says the mind is the ground and one nature is the king. What's the difference between the mind? Is there a difference between the mind and one's nature?
Aha. I will go into that more next week if you wish. There's expression that's used is the mind and the nature. Okay, and sometimes they're used interchangeably and sometimes they're used in contrast. Now here's a contrast being used. For a quick answer tonight, the way to think about it is the nature is a capacity. Okay, it's a capability. The mind is the functioning that then renders that capability into something. So, for example, if you think, I gave an example, you think there's just a piece of jade. It's a potential, but working on it, you can turn it into a lovely sculpture or you can mess it completely up. So this relationship between the mind and the nature, it says you light up the mind and you see the nature. So by lighting up, by purifying the mind, by correcting the mind, getting it, it becomes a light that can then see the nature. But the nature itself is just a capacity or potential. It's not like an organ or entity. It's this essential capability that we have for the 10,000 things. But the mind, how that mind works with the nature, either turns it into something enlightened or awakened or the other way around. So mind and nature are sort of like substance and function, you could say, if you want to use Chinese philosophy. But we'll go into this a little more because, and then sometimes here it'll say the nature is the Buddha nature. It's the essential nature. It's the true mind. They're one and the same. And so then sometimes the text will just say these are just different functions of the same overarching wholeness. Sometimes we talk about it as mind, sometimes we talk about it as nature. Okay, but it's basically saying everything is made from this alone. This interplay between, and that's why when people say mind, you say, well, it includes the six sense organs, the six sense objects, the consciousness in between. So now you have consciousness, mind, and nature. So maybe next week we'll go into this a little more and try to get as clear as we can. But it's a good question, yeah. Okay. Any announcements?
Yes, tomorrow we'll have holiday recitation running day called Visual Name will start at 8 a.m. with the transmission and precept. This is optional, and 9 o'clock is the start of the recitation. Around 11 will be lunch provided here, and we start around 4:30, 5 o'clock here. In the evening will be the lecture, and Monday we have the Buddhism for the modern mind by Dr. Hours, and
So on Monday you can have Buddhism for the modern mind, on Friday night you can have Buddhism for the old mind. Old mind, modern mind, same mind. We'll transfer in English. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may their minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Ding li san bao